Hello. I'd like to introduce a topic. I've got a few questions that I would like for us to try to answer together. And this is going to center around a couple of questions. And the first question is this. The first question is, what is language? You ever found yourself asking yourself this question? I think this might be one of the most important questions that educators can begin to ask themselves. This is a question that we often take for granted, that it's true that if someone were to ask you, how did you learn to speak? How did you learn to speak whatever your first language is? For example, my first language is English. If you were to ask me, how did you learn to speak English? I would say, honestly, I don't remember. I have no idea. I speak it, right? It's part of who I am. And so a lot of times I think we take this for granted. What is language? We just assume that it's there. We assume that it's always just part of who we are. Okay, and this is a question that we're going to explore together. But there's also a lot of other academic questions, I think, that are interesting to explore that can help educators learn how to be better educators. So let's answer this question first, okay? And this is just an introductory. I just want to set the stage for where I want us to go with this, because there are a lot of places to go. But first, let's just look at sort of a surface level. If we're just if we're just taking a step back, looking at language as a third person, linguists often describe language in maybe four areas. And so let's look at these four areas. Okay, so language has sounds. All right, in linguistics, it's referred to as a phonetic structure. Okay, language also, of course, involves meaning. What words mean? These sounds are combined to make words that have meaning. Okay, that's going to be the study of semantics. Okay, if we come down over here, we're also going to have, do a little line here, make some little boxes. Let's see, what do we have? Oh, we have, okay, language is obviously, words are put in order. The study and looking at the order of those words is called, I made a mistake. Again, the order of words is called syntax. So if you're looking at why words are in certain order, you're going to be looking at the study of syntax. And finally, the fourth category is when you look at how words change, whether you're adding suffixes or prefixes, or maybe there's conjugations in certain verbs for certain languages, you're going to be looking at the morphology. Okay, so if a linguist were to answer this question, one way they may answer this question of what is language, you could say, well, a language has sounds, which is the phonetic structure. Words have meaning, so there are semantics involved in this. There's also the way that words are ordered so that they can be more intelligible, right? And so that's going to be the syntax of the language. And then words can shift and change, and how those words shift and change can affect oftentimes the semantics or the meanings of those words. And that's going to be the study and the morphology, okay? So on the surface, as an observer, we can start to look at these four categories. And I do want to take us through a study of the phonetic structure. For example, the phonetic structure of English and how this phonetic structure may differ from other languages. Because remember, for me and what I do, I work in public schools with students who are learning the language of instruction, which would be they would be learning English, for example, and they have other languages at home, or it could be possibly if they're in a Spanish immersion program or in a two-way dual language program, they would be learning the other target language, okay, that is not English. And so you can look at the phonetic structures that languages have, and there's a whole study of that. Okay, we can go through breaking down all of the individual phonemes, which are the individual sounds of a language. Okay, and then you can start looking at meaning. How is meaning constructed? How do we determine what a meaning of a word is? the order of words and how words change. Okay, so this is just a very broad beginning of asking ourselves what is language and what we can begin to look for as people who are being thoughtful about what is language. Now, there's another question that I think is more interesting, honestly, than looking at each one of these. A lot of times this reminds me of grammar lessons in school, which I never really enjoyed. But as I've studied and learned more about language, I've become fascinated with what it is. What is language? And how do we learn it? So I want us to ask another question, and then I'm going to provide sort of a frame of where we can go from here. Okay, and what I want us to look at or think about is how do we learn, and notice that this will become more clear, how do we learn or acquire language? Because there's a difference between what is learning a language and what is acquiring a language. And we're not going to get into that at this point, but I want to set where I want us to go, three main theoretical models that can help us structure and ideas of how people have thought about that we learn language. Okay, so the first person or framework that we can look at for this is a behaviorist. And the primary person or you would say researcher in this area would be our friend Mr. Skinner. And Mr. Skinner was convinced that we learned things, that language was in essence a behavior that we were conditioned to learn. So conditioned. So he was convinced that language, we learn language through the process of as learning a behavior through rewards and punishments. So as a child learns to make sounds, they get positive reinforcement, okay, or negative reinforcement for certain sounds or words that they make. And then as that process continues, that is how we learn language. This is very oversimplified, and we're going to look at this in more depth, but this is a behaviorist model of how the behaviorist believed that we learn language. And you'll see a lot of behaviorist theory or philosophy in behavior management. Okay, we always say that you always want to reward the positive behavior. You always want to give consequences for negative behavior. That comes from a behaviorist approach. Well, Skinner also thought that this applied to how we learned language. He believed that really we were born with a blank slate, that our mind was what's called a tabula rasa, okay, that it's blank, and that as we develop through our interactions and through our conditioned responses, our responses get conditioned through the process of rewards and punishments. And through that process, we get to language, okay? So that is Skinner's approach. And that is one area that we will look at, okay? There's also another approach, I don't know if I'm going to have enough room here. We may have to come down here and do the last one. The next sort of theory of language learning is going to be constructivist, and in particular, social constructivist, okay? Now, this theory is that as humans have social interactions, and that social interactions is primary to humans, that it is through social interactions. So it's through. So a social constructivist would say it's not necessarily like you're being conditioned, like a behavior is being conditioned, but it's part of who we are as humans is that we have social interaction. In order to facilitate that social interaction, we've developed language, and language helps us to continue to facilitate culture and through our social interactions, this is how we develop language. The primary voice in this area is our friend, Mr. Vygotsky. Okay, Mr. Vygotsky has a ton of stuff that applies to lots of second language learning theory. Some of the phrases you may have heard before that we'll be looking at are ZPD, the zone of proximal development, okay, very Vygotskian. He's also very scaffolding, okay. He's going to be talking about external versus okay, Vygotsky's going to be talking about all of these areas. He's going to be talking about the zone of proximal development. He's going to be talking about the process of scaffolding and in the how we learn language as we scaffold it. He's also going to talk about how once language is sort of established, there's the difference between external and internal language. Okay, he says things, for example, of what the child can do in cooperation today, he'll be able to do alone tomorrow. So it's this idea, right? What a child can do in cooperation today, he can do alone tomorrow. That language is constructed, okay, through social interaction. This is a very popular theory. Very popular theory, a very strong theory in a lot of ways. And Vygotsky has a lot of things that we can really think hard about. Okay, we're also going to see a lot with Vygotsky. There's a lot of interplay between language and thought, and that language is sort of a tool that's trying to interpret thought, and then language can in turn sort of shape thoughts. Another let me read this to you, and this is in the spirit of Vygotsky. A word devoid of thought is a dead thing, and a thought unembodied in words remains a shadow. So there's going to be this interplay between language and thought, and that language helps to develop thought, and that thought can help develop language, and they're sort of really connected. But again, it's all going to be done through this process of this social, it's going to be constructed through social interaction, through this process of the zone of proximal development, through scaffolding, okay, through internal and external languages going back and forth, and then this idea of this interplay of ideas, okay. Fascinating stuff, and a lot that we can pull from this. We can talk a lot about a lot of this and how it applies to a lot of language learning theories as they apply to instructional practices. Okay, so we're going to be looking at Mr. Vygotsky. Okay, we're going to be looking at Mr. Skinner and how he's saying that language is developed. And this is going to bring us to the last sort of framework that I'm going to want us to look into and explore. And that is going to be what we're going to refer to as, I don't know if I'm spelling this right, an innatist point of view, or we'll say an internal. Okay, so if we look at this, a behaviorist is going to argue that language comes from external influences. So I'm going to write that up here. This is going to be, I'm going to put it in parentheses. Okay, this behaviorism is going to be from external pressure. It's going to be from external influence onto the mind. Okay, that is how language is developed. It's through the mind's interaction with what's external, and it's getting conditioned, okay, rewards and punishments. Okay, whereas social constructivists are going to say that it comes through social interaction. Okay, but when we get over here, an innatist view, an internal structure, this is going to be Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky is known as the father of modern linguistics. Okay, so he is probably the most cited, he is the most cited intellectual that's going to find in the world of linguistics, okay? And he is completely opposite of the behaviorist. He's responding in a lot of ways to the behaviorist. Okay, but what does Chomsky say? Chomsky says that language is something not that we learn, it's something that develops, and that it is So what Chomsky says is there's something innate, there's something biological in our minds that he refers to as the language acquisition device. And he doesn't know what it is. He says you can't really put your finger on it. But what he says is that it's clear that if you look at humanity, if you look at the fact that in all cultures and all people who are humans, they possess the language capacity. So he says there must be something innate in the internal structure of the mind that allows us to acquire or to develop language. And he refers to it as the language acquisition device. Now, he says that it's a totally subconscious process. He says you don't learn language any more than you learn to see or any more than you grow. That it's part of what it is to be human. It's part of what it is to be human to have language. So how do we learn language? He would say we don't really learn language. It's part of who we are as a human because we have built into us a language acquisition device, and that device is always active, it's always looking, and it's always developing. And so we're going to look at more in particular Chomsky and his, here he is, Chomsky, and sort of the other people that he's influenced along the way. Some other thinkers in this area are going to be Steven Pinker, although he could probably be sort of somewhere in here, and Stephen Krashen, spell his name correctly, Stephen Krashen, who's going to be firmly in here with Chomsky. So what I'm basically going to want us to do through this process is try to understand what is language and how do we acquire it. And this is a really big question. But what I want to try to convince you of is that this is a very important question. It is maybe the fundamental question that as educators that we have to ask ourselves, because at the heart of language is, as Vygotsky would say, the interplay between language and thought, and that thought influences language, and that language influences thought, and that if we're at the business of anything as educators, it is about developing students' capacity to have the tools they need to be able to think well. What I'm trying to argue is that linguistics and that language is the fundamental question that we can look at to help us become better educators and maybe even more curious people. So again, this is just the beginning. This is where we want to go with this. Okay, we want to look at what is language. We want to look at the sound structures of language. We want to look at meaning and how do we know what words mean, or how can we even acquire meaning of words that may be unfamiliar to us. The order, the syntax, and how changing the order and playing with that and looking at the structures of the syntax to make maybe writing really well. Or the morphology, how changing words and affects the semantics. And then this will really kind of, if you can understand these three main areas of how we learn and acquire language, you'll be able to ask yourself questions about your own practice as an educator and which camp that you fall into, because it will affect how you teach. It really will change the sort of the overall tone of your lessons, and it also will help you understand how to understand students who are in this process of acquiring and learning language, which everyone is, but in particular students who are learning this as an additional language, emergent bilingual students. So I hope that this is going to be interesting to you. I find this a fascinating journey. And I can't wait to continue to share more. Thanks for watching.